Welcome to Excavations, where we talk about class and get into the weeds about medieval European polities, although probably not in the weeds enough for the true nerds about it. Um, so we were finishing up talking about the great expansionist empires, why they kind of happened in Western Europe, what class contradictions led to that. Um, but let's ask ourselves, why did Marx think that basically there were three main classes: rentiers, capitalists, and workers? And then he mentions 15 other class categories, according to at least one account by, I think, John Elster. But really, three come up over and over and over again. It's the lumpen proletariat, which he eventually divides into the lumpen proletariat and the lumpen proletariat so-called, which is confusing. Um, uh, the petit bourgeois, the peasants, who may or may not be a class, and he also talks about the surplus population and the reserve army of labor. You will note that ruling class is not listed in here. In fact, political notions of class almost really aren't there at all, except as rentiers. Capitalists and workers are considered the primary contradiction. But one of the things that I want to point out, Marx didn't think that the economy of medieval Europe was actually totally epiphenomenal to class power. He actually talks about this as a rationalization of capitalism, that the bourgeoisie had rationalized a power relations by making them primarily political economic and not just about violence extraction. That's part of what that's part of what he sees as the positive element of the bourgeoisie. Now, he doesn't get into the weeds about this, and he wouldn't for a couple of reasons. One, however you think about his framework is essentially Hegelian, which also means that there's stages of development based off of Western European stages of development in Christendom, which are taken as a given, which Marx does seem to question at the end of his life, but doesn't in the main period of his writing. In the early periods of his writing, he even is kind of, happy about European imperialism because it explained capitalism to the other areas of the world. Later, again, he turns against that statement, but that's his initial impression. And so why do you think that is? A lot of people, one of the things that you're dealing with when Marx is writing about this time period, and maybe this will make it a little bit more obvious, is outside of England and France, most of the polities that actually exist in Europe are falling apart during this time period, which I don't think we talk about enough. So what do I mean by that? Well, you got Spain and Portugal. Okay, they have big empires. They're relatively stable. But if you got shut out of this empire game, if you're, say, I don't know, one of the bunches of different polities in, say, the Holy Roman Empire, or if you are in Poland, Lithuania, or if you are in the Nordic,
even
the Nordic kingdoms, Finland, any of these places, you're not in the Dutch republics, your governments start getting real unstable. Or Italy, the Italian city states in the various states of Italy, like the Habsburg Empire, the Papal States, etc., get real unstable. So there really isn't a state governing these places in the same way. And I think that does need to be taken into account when thinking about why Marx doesn't see it as that important in his early and middle writings.
And I think that, especially given his emphasis on revolution, the French Revolution was such an epical event that it ushered in a period of extinction or adaptation for the remaining monarchies. The pressure of success, the economically driven success of the westernmost parts of Europe, together with the demonstration effect that you can guillotine a king, you can reorganize your political structures, you can break out of the status hierarchies of feudalism, which feudal subjects had been told were eternal. That gave those Western states the feeling of inevitability, and the remaining European polities a perpetual state of crisis.
So,
and
yeah.
It also, the one thing that can't be underemphasized too is the incredible role of industrialization, not only in changing class relations within the leading countries, but also in pointing towards a radically more productive and different future where you couldn't just go around plundering wealth from the four corners of the earth. Everything that was within easy reach had already been plundered, and now the game was reinvestment in the development of productive capacity. That was the basis of the power of nations, and the advantage of a capitalist social organization over any existing alternative was, at that point, and not just for Marx, but for virtually any Western observer, taken for granted.
Yeah. So you have highly productive sector. You also have this idea of nation states emerging, which Marxism is concurrent with and fights for. I mean, like Engels is a minor general in the 1848 revolution. So these kind of the collapse of one form of state and the beginnings of relatively weak states on the other. But these states don't stay weak, and that's one of the things that I think kind of plagues Marxism immediately. Is like you have the reassertion of state power pretty quickly in almost every one of these areas, from the Metternich regime to France, etc. And Marx actually starts playing around with different class theories to work that out. That's where the lumpen proletariat comes from. That's where this idea of like, well, there's this rabble that are excluded from production that a monarchical or dictatorial power can appeal to. That is, both of all classes and not of any particular class. And that is where that can be the power base, along with the avoiding proletarianized petit bourgeois. But we have to remember, like, the whole concept of a small bourgeoisie is kind of new because there wasn't really a big one until recently. Like, so
yeah, the pre-French revolutionary conception of class, and you could see this in the formulation of the Estates General, was aristocracy, church, and commoners. And the term bourgeois originally just meant commoner. It meant a city dweller who did not have any status.
What's the relation to the word burgher?
Same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's only when you start looking at the bourgeoisie seriously and you break out of this tripartite legacy social vision that you can distinguish between elements within that third estate, between the haute bourgeois and the ones who aren't immiserated, aren't explicitly exploited by someone in particular. They're not peasants, but they're also not really the thing that we're talking about when we say bourgeoisie, hence the petite bourgeoisie.
Right. Yeah, the small bourgeoisie. And
they're working for themselves. They don't necessarily have full ownership of the means of production. What other ways do we have to?
Well, they own their own means of production, but they don't usually command anyone else's labor. So you can't really say they're exploiting people in the same way.
Yeah, their means of production is typically their own labor, but in a way that commands a premium and retains a certain dignity of life, compared to what happens to dispossessed peasants or the urban poor.
And they aspire to be proper bourgeois, to stop working. And
I mean, to the extent that they can even imagine that. But the bigger fear is decline and class derogation. All right, the French have a term déclassé, which now means sort of tacky, but it originally was a legal category, which means that you lose your class standing. And it was scandalous and disgraceful. And the fear of the distinction that they could maintain, the social distinction between them and the proletariat, was one of their main drivers towards a type of conservative politics which would freeze social structures and allow them to persist in the middle.
Right, yeah, and Marx thinks that they have to do this by appealing to an authoritarian figure, aka a Bonapartist figure, to force the freeze. And he also thinks that the bigger bourgeoisie may support this temporarily to stable up power as power slips, like as the equalizing goes beyond their control and the things that they don't want, like depropertization and whatnot. Because one of the things that happens immediately, and you even see this as early as the English Civil War, is the former peasants start going like, well, why is there property at all? Like, if it's not justified by divine right, and it really is because you guys said so, then why the hell do I have to deal with it?
Yeah, I say not so.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a question about whether or not they have the military capacity to do much about it. And so, in the instances of both England and in France, socialism starts to emerge immediately as an answer from classical liberalism.
And in the context of the 30 Years' War and the Reformation, it had already emerged in Germany with a Christian New Testament type of orientation.
Yeah. Which, and like the levelers, I mean, we think about like the Anabaptists, for example, and oh my God, did they make sure to put that down?
Mm-hmm.
So you already see this appeal to like state authority. But there's a tension in Marx, because if you read Marx's political writings, he seems perfectly aware of this. Like, he knows about the enclosures, he knows about like the land use taxes, he knows about all this stuff. But when he recounts it in Capital, because he's critiquing Smith, it's not there, because it's not part of Smith either. Smith is concerned about landlords and rentierism, and like, yes, he'd like to hang all of them basically, but it's partly also about, by the time you get to Ricardo, about like stabilizing a tax base and stabilizing a government for bourgeois stability and interstate competition. So the role of interstate competition in Marxism, interestingly, only gets re-brought in when we start talking about theories of imperialism. But I'm just going to go ahead and put my cards on the table. Marxist theories of imperialism are incredibly vague. Basically, everything counts.
What do you mean by that? What's everything?
Well, both colonialism, but also like trade deals, trade arbitrage, power leveraging, trade blocks.
I don't like it, therefore imperialism.
Right, like, so any national or international state development, any competition between nations can be justified to be materialist. And the other thing, imperialist, not materialist. And the other thing that this creates is an interesting conflict, because Marxism does think that there's two emergents. One is proletarianness and working class are historically coterminous, but Marx is actually pretty specific that they're only historically coterminous. So, for example, to be proletarian is to be propertyless and not invested in the system, going all the way back to ancient Rome. To be a worker, you are only not invested in the system because you don't have anything but your labor power, right? one of the tensions and one of the ambiguities that modern Marxism deals with is those words, even in Marx, don't always mean the same thing. So there's constantly new theories about what counts as and what does not count as proletarian. So you start getting these, like some of these happen in Marx's lifetime. Like the idea of labor aristocracy starts coming up. They didn't invent it, but they use it. What does that mean? Well, you have a class within a class of labor, kind of interim tier that are workers. They don't own property, but they have special privileges. Are they a class? Well, for Marx's definition, no. One of the other things that emerges in the definition of Marxism is Marx and Engels don't distinguish between class and caste at all.
Interesting.
Lenin doesn't either, really. But after Lenin, you sure do. Because the reason why I say that is Lenin actually refers to legal statuses as class statuses. So like intellectua, and we'll get to that. Later Marxists try to argue that the only classes that exist at all, that have any real existence in capitalism, are non-legal classes. So worker and bourgeois, which are only legal in so much that ownership is a matter of law.
Interesting. So we're saying that maybe even in a sort of a false way, or at least in a very limited one, Marx and Engels' definitions of class seem to be economically deterministic because they're in critique of the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith and Ricardo.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, I think that's their primary concern, but
also it's the base follows superstructure, right?
Right.
So their view is that, and this is why the Petit bourgeoisie was considered a transitory phenomenon, that maybe a small number of them would cobble together enough of the table stake to get promoted into the haute bourgeoisie, but the rest would just be proletarianized because of the iron law of exploitation. And so any class structure which was based on legal distinctions would inevitably be corroded by the force of capitalism and collapse into just a pure economic relation.
That's a good point.
Which is something that they can see happening in many European countries, right?
Yeah, and they advocate for it in the colonies too, in the Americas, because they're also against slavery, which is a legal category.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and the aristocrats which couldn't refashion themselves into successful haute bourgeois were actually some of the most pathetic, desperate, clinging types, because without being able to make that jump, then they risked proletarianization that was all the more humiliating given the heights at which their families began.
They become mercenary warlords mostly, but still,
depends. They have daughters too.
Yeah, that's right.
And the daughters often become governances for their social inferiors. And this phenomenon he takes to be, and it's not the first time he does this, he sees development in Western Europe and he treats it as an iron law of history. And then his students have to figure out how to revise that when history refuses to cooperate. So I think now would be a good time to pivot towards Russia and talk about what happens when global capitalism is already emergent, but you are in one of the laggard states that takes that forced march towards development. And in the case of Russia, you have movement towards capitalism and industrialization, which is led by the state. There are very few indigenous bourgeois that could play that role. So instead, an absolutist monarchy through through the administrators that it can muster. Some of them are aristocrats, princes. Some of them are individuals who distinguish themselves in education or in the military. And those agents become the executors of drives towards industrialization and development. They're the ones who build railroads. They're the ones who settle Siberia. They're the ones who put up factories and things. Often, people will be brought in from abroad for specialized skills.
And this was by conscientious design.
This was precisely. It was essentially pre-planning planning, but not done comprehensively, but on a piecemeal basis. And remember,
don't they compete with Western powers and also the state? I mean, like I think about the Russian state. It's relatively young. I know we don't think about that. There are countries that, you know, going all the way back to Rollo and the Rus, you know, supposedly Vikings, but there's not really like the Russian state as we know it is consolidated, you know, after like basically Ivan the Terrible, and it's also weird. Like it does not fit patterns that of Europe. Like there's a state within the state too. It's very strange.
Instead, you have the unification of the sacral and secular in the body of the Tsar. It's a frontier state rather than a land-hungry state. So there's all kinds of elements that make Russia distinctive. Not just this, Russia's an extreme case, but this could also apply to Austria-Hungary. It also applies to Turkey. It applies to even East Asian countries that face similar pressure, although there's a different configuration of forces.
Yeah, the Qing Empire, the Raj, etc. All of them. If you're not colonized by a European, you're also having this problem.
Interesting.
And this leads to a different type of class configuration. Property, too, only exists at the sufferance of the Tsar. So even great princes can have their titles revoked. It's not uncommon for aristocrats to be shuffled around in order to prevent them from creating territorial bases that could challenge central authority. And rather than your class standing being a reflection of your place in the economic system, since the economic system is so immature, and don't forget, Russia doesn't abolish serfdom until the 1860s, and even after that, there's all kinds of post-feudal dues that essentially keep the peasants bound to landowners. It means that you don't actually need to use money to develop, because you can just coerce labor and exploit them through social status and the threat of force.
Yeah, and this is why Marx has called this backwards, is because it reminded them of what they saw as a description of medieval. It is a little different, to be fair, but I mean, like, it does sound like it. Like, the peasant commons are like the peasant commons in England are in France. Serfdom, you know, is first abolished in the Italian city-states. God, probably about 14 something. It's not it's like takes another 500 years almost before Russia does it.
And it also means that when it comes to developing that kind of economic productive power, which is in the private hands, the hands of the bourgeoisie in Western Europe, that power only exists through your relationship to the state. And this goes all the way down to the level of what would be the Petit bourgeoisie in Western Europe. The Petit bourgeoisie in Western Europe secures its education and the distinctiveness of its labor, as opposed to common workers, through its own strength, right? Like it's a private system of development. You might pay for your children to go to school. Yeah, exactly. Or you get an apprenticeship somewhere.
Or you marry well and your wife does it, but you cure it by your own means.
Yeah, right. Exactly. While in these Eastern states, and this goes on actually through the 20th century in a lot of places, your place in that class that can command a premium and a certain amount of status respect, status deference, through its role as educated labor, as specialists, as doctors, engineers, you name it. That comes from your that's basically granted by the state. You were educated because of a public school. There's some institution, some state institution that has put its stamp on you, and in exchange for that education, you owe service. And that is what's distinctive about the Intelligentsia as opposed to the PMC. The Intelligentsia has a similar function, but its relationship to private property, its relationship to the state, is very different than that which you see in the West.
Right. This is important. I mean, Lenin comes from this class too, so it's something Lenin thinks a lot about.
Most of them do.
Sure.
Yeah, and this class is an intermediary class, but it's not a bourgeois class. They don't have private capital. They also aren't really aristocrats in the way that you would think. They would be more like, there are equivalencies in Western Europe and late medieval and early modern polities, like Jews, like the lord's like the king's peasant hands. Mm-hmm. Sometimes a group of people called the salariat, which people think means now like, oh, the salaried workers. No, salary in this case means you're paid by the state,
right?
And so you get a stipend by the state to live off of.
Low clergy, in many places, and often in countries which practice primogeniture, you'd have second, third sons of aristocrats, where this is the best that they could do.
Interesting.
In places that didn't practice primogeniture, Poland, Lithuania, you have the family lands of an aristocratic family are divided for each generation in order to allow each son to be landed in their own right. But over time, this leads to such a fragmentation of landholding that even though you still are technically a noble, you cannot live off of your landholding, and it's better to be an engineer in an army corps or the supervisor of some government ministry, an archivist, a forester, than face pure proletarianization. So the Intelligentsia captures a very broad array of class origins within it. One reason why the Intelligentsia is often nationalist, whether civic nationalist or ethno-nationalist, in fact, they actually tend to lean more civic nationalist, is precisely because they are not united by a common origin, but instead are united by a common affinity towards a homeland.
AKA a common paycheck towards a common state.
Well, yeah. How were they received by, the former serfs, the peasants, the proletarian, eventually?
Much depended on, a great deal depended on their personal class origin, so you couldn't generalize. For instance, you would have Intelligentsia professors, for instance, that were essentially treated as nerd lords by the aristocracy. Like, you may not actually have tremendous wealth, but clearly you are a person of culture, you come from the right background, so
you're going to
you
handle
love us.
law for us and clergy stuff for us, right?
Exactly. So they call you sir, right? And they respect you. If you're a rural school teacher, and you're not scared of helping dig in the dirt when it's potato season, then the peasants are like, you know, not so bad.
Not so bad. He's all right. How does this translate into the, opportunity for building a classless society if there's already such a, no particular origin of?
So this is an interesting theory that comes up in Germany and then again in the United States and in Italy simultaneously. And that is this idea that it's this group of people, this productive owning middle class that produces this revolutionary cadre. Even in Marxism, there's kind of a hedging on this because Marxists do not pretend actually historically that the socialists were from the working class. They don't say that.
It can arise from
except for Kim Il-sung.
Right.
He was 100% both a godchild of the Korean heavens and a son of the soil of the people.
Right. But in general, the idea was that
you should see his house.
Socialists tended to emerge from the class A elements and would merge with the, quote, advanced parts of the proletariat, unquote, because they saw their interest in the proletariat and not the bourgeoisie. This is a vagary in Marxism, but it's there, and it's there in Marx too. Marx realizes that about himself. He is not a worker, nor is he bourgeois. Right?
Right.
There's a certain self-hatred around it too. For instance, that the insistence that this is not productive labor that's being conducted, that this is not a productive class, and that what it took to amend that position was actually the success of the Bolshevik Revolution, because once you pull out the intelligentsia elements, and because much of the intelligentsia was considered to be class complicit, many of them leaned towards the SRs or the cadets rather than the Bolsheviks, and the proletarians were the big show. They were the heroes. So if you put organization, innovation, and all of these other tasks directly in the hands of proletarians who are not trained in the relevant technical fields, your economy comes to a screeching halt. And then it's like, crap, we're going to have to find some of these petit bourgeois intelligentsia types, even those that may have a questionable political background, and reintroduce them to the economy just to reclaim the condition that we had prior to the revolution. And a new status was carved out by the Bolsheviks, Spitznit, or specialists, right? So you weren't a manager, you weren't a boss, you had no authority, but because of the particular skill set you have, you had a role to play even in this post-revolutionary proletarian dictatorship of the proletariat-driven economy. And that, as much as they wanted this to be a transitory element, it turned out to be a permanent feature, which actually leads into the bureaucratic collectivism of that Trotsky warned against, and the reemergence of class in the early Soviet Union.
Well, can we take a moment and just discuss a little bit how different skill sets were acquired after the Bolshevik Revolution? How do we maintain the intelligentsia and then move into his nomenclatura?
So you can't teach somebody a skill you don't have. So the specialists that were brought back, one of their immediate duties was to train workers to basically replace them. And it didn't usually work out that well because, especially by the early 30s, if you were a specialist and you made yourself expendable, you would be expended, right? This is the Stalin period, and class origin or ethnic origin or any demographic imperfection would be justification enough to get you purged, and you had NKVD officials that had quotas to fill. So there was an obvious disincentive for skills transmission. The Bolsheviks attempted to increase education, expand education as much as possible, as aggressively as possible. And they were successful in some fields, less successful in others. Basically, primary education, overcoming illiteracy, that's something you could do.
Okay.
Technical fields, things that required advanced mathematics, where only 7 people in the Russian Empire knew how to had the skill set to be able to pass that on. Good luck with that, right? Like there's 7 people and 6 of them sided with Trotsky, and the 7th might be gay, right? So they one place that they looked to, and this is why they had to take this step, was Western leftists. They brought in a great deal of engineers and skilled workers from the United States, among other places,
Interesting.
In order to fill that role and to provide training to what were considered to be reliable proletarian elements, because they had destroyed that capacity domestically. And the another challenge in regenerating the intelligentsia, reproducing the intelligentsia, was the fact that education was seen as a vehicle for the propagation of ideology. And Marxism often gets misinterpreted as a comprehensive science of history. It's a little like some Muslims or other very strong, very literate, very profoundly literary religious traditions will claim that the holy book is entirely omnicompetent. Everything you know is in it. Therefore, education need only be training in this one area, and if there's any contradiction between an emerging scientific or technical field and the ideological religious message that is supposed to be the basis of the political order, well, it's not the ideology that's going to bend.
Sure, this is dogmatism.
Yeah, you had Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, where in that case, an entire subfield of biology related to agricultural science, which you'd think would be extraordinarily significant for the USSR, was put in the hands of an ideological hack who was just wrong on the basis and believed that you could apply Marxist ideology to teach grain to grow better. And if you disagreed with Lysenko, if there was an attempt to correct him, well, he was a favorite of Stalin. You were purged.
Yeah, this is an issue with the codification of Marxism in general, but particularly in the Soviet Union, because one of the complications to all this is, like, a lot of Marxist work wasn't readily available to anybody, or it was barely available.
Like the Bible pre-Reformation.
Right.
Yeah.
so a lot of times, like, ambiguities in Marxist work were being papered over, or later on you see other ambiguities made into a huge deal so that you could just ignore prior history. Cough, cough, Althusser, cough, cough. But you have this, for example, Marx's writings on imperialism are kind of all over the place. Marx's writings on how socialists are supposed to relate to national liberation, also all over the place. All these things are actually codified later. Another thing that happens in Germany is that the predictions about the universalization of the proletariat don't happen. This leads to the first revisionist controversy. So, and then you have the whole, everybody thought that immiseration was going to happen, and Marxists kept predicting a final crisis. And the biggest one is actually in the 1950s. Everyone thought the war stalled the crisis, and then the capitalism was going to collapse in the 1950s. And when I say everyone, I do mean almost all socialists thought this. And then when it didn't happen, you started getting new class theories emerging.
Right.
But this had already happened before. And what I think is interesting about this is I think the first round of this is more empirically accurate than the second round of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so this will probably be where we tie this up today, because this pivots us to both the elite school and Weber. But what those schools share is at least part of them are burnt Marxists. Like, or they're burnt people who have a relationship to Marx. So Weber's got a tie to both Marxism and the German historical school, which was a competing form of economics and socialism.
Right.
And Weber kind of, Weber, Sombart, and a few other of the late thinkers of that school try to bridge the gap. And they start looking at these other elements to try to come up with a better theory of class.
And quite frankly, and I'm willing to accept disagreement on this, but in my view, pure unrevised application of orthodox Marxism is very limited in its applicability and its insight. It on certain topics it can work very well, but the same can be said of non-Marxist theories. And the challenge is to have a synthesis where the legitimate insights of a figure like Max Weber or even the Italian elitists can inform the perspectives on development, exploitation, class relations that come out of Marx.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we even see this in the Soviet Union. Like, what you start getting all kinds of new theories emerge about what's actually going on, even within the kind of Marxist-Leninist Soviet orthodoxy. We're not even talking about like the left opposition, like Trotsky or whatever, because things don't go as planned. And
is this seen as revisionism immediately, or do they kind of try to roll with the punches?
Okay, so this is what's confusing. Revisionism in the Second International refers to the debate between Kautsky and Bernstein, where Bernstein, I think, actually tries to describe what the party's actually doing, and Kautsky's trying to uphold an orthodoxy that's more consistent with what he views Marx as saying, but neither one of them really are being borne out by reality.
So unfair.
I know this is unpopular amongst Marxists, but to say that, like, when Bernstein makes a point against Kautsky that, like, the proletariat is not the majority of the population, if by the proletariat you mean productive workers.
Well, I think we could probably call this show unpopular among Marxists, but that's what we're here to do. A little syncretism, a little bit of everything.
Here's the thing, like, even most orthodox Marxists, and this is going to be the point I end on, deviate the fuck on this stuff, because Marx just doesn't say anything about it one way or the other. And if it's not calling everything PMC, the prior thing is to call everything Petit Bourgeois,
right?
Even if it's not. Like,
sure,
even if there's no small capital involved.
Interesting.
So, but we'll have to get to that. And the crisis happens twice. It happens once at the turn of the century in like 1905, and then it happens again in the 50s. And in both these times, you get a lot of production of new class theories. And the other thing that happens, the reason why you said I said calling something revisionism is confusing, is because the anti-revisionist in the Soviet Union are just loyal to Stalin. They actually posit new class theories to remain loyal.
Yeah. All right.
Which
well,
itself is kind of an interesting problem. So
it really is. Okay. Well, more a little on that next time. And then we'll work our way into the 1940s, the 1960s, and up
hopefully.
until the 21st century.
You did make me go through 5,000 years of history in an hour.
I'm very forceful and coercive.
All right. On that note, we have to end.
Thank you.